Fox News alert on Japan at this moment. What is being called a meltdown is underway at a Japanese nuclear plant. This is just crossing the wires, according to the Associated Press. Japanese government officials cannot say whether this is something that can be contained or whether this is a precursor to the worst-case scenario they have been talking about. Welcome to America Live on a very busy Monday. I'm Megyn Kelly. The Japanese nuclear concerns started as soon as the quake hit. The power went out, the cooling systems failed. And Saturday, an explosion rocked the Fukushima plant because of a pressure buildup. The experts told us everything was okay. That was Friday afternoon, because they said the shield around the nuclear material did not crack or melt. Last night, another explosion. And now we are hearing that coolant levels have dropped. That is a dangerous situation because it exposes the nuclear fuel rods, leading them to overheat. That could allow those fuel rods to melt down. And when that super hot radioactive material falls to the bottom of the reactor, which is not prepared to have that happen, it can melt through the protective shield, producing what they call a full meltdown. Officials are now worried, they say, worried about the overheating of 2 of the reactors they're now watching. They're also raising concerns that fallout from a radioactive leak may last for months. Kamasami Kong is a radio host for Tokyo FM. He is an American living in Japan. He has been monitoring the local coverage for us, which often in situations like this can be the best and most up-to-date. And we want to check in with him for the latest from Japan. Kamasami?
Yes, hello, Megan. How are you?
I'm fine. Tell us what you're hearing.
Well, what we're hearing right now is just basically what you have just mentioned, that the 3rd reactor is overheating and that they are going to have to start releasing more steam into the atmosphere at twice the safe level. The operators, however, must release this. They must release the steam to release the pressure that's in there that's building. Otherwise, it could be more of a disaster. People in the area have been evacuated, of course, and they may not be able to return to their homes for months. And there is some concern at this particular time that that radioactive steam, the plumes coming out, it's not likely, but there is some concern that it could drift to as far as Alaska, Hawaii, and to the U.S. territories.
Last we heard, they were furiously pumping in seawater to try to cool these reactors, to try to keep these fuel rods cooled because the cooling systems had failed. Is that still underway, and how are, according to local reports, are those efforts going?
Those efforts are continuing, and that's what they have to do at this particular time because apparently there is no other way to keep these reactors and these rods cool at this particular time. This is the last-ditch effort before what could be a nuclear meltdown.
What are they now doing with the folks who have been evacuated?
We don't know what those folks are doing yet. We just know that they've been moved out of their homes, and there's no word as to when they might be able to return. But apparently they are being moved to a safe area at this time. All
right, Kamasami, thank you so much for the update. Meantime, folks, we are getting new details about a dangerous situation for 17 crew members on board the USS Reagan. According to military officials, the Navy crew was exposed to low levels of radiation from the nuclear plant during a relief mission, sparking a full-on decontamination scrub. Those few hours of exposure, we're told, is equivalent to 1 month of natural radiation that you might get from the sun or natural earth elements. Sensors also went off indicating there was radioactivity on the ship. Officials say that all the crew members are being very closely monitored right now. And it is a race against the clock to rescue millions of quake victims who are without food, without water, and very obviously, thanks to the earthquake, the tsunami, and now the nuclear problems, without electricity. We are also getting jaw-dropping images of the devastating tsunami that we had not yet seen before today. Take a look at this. Unimaginable. Homes literally ripped from their foundation and carried off into a river of destruction. Right now, search and recovery efforts are underway in Japan. Japanese officials now fear at least 10,000 people may have died. Right now, the toll stands close to 3,000, the official toll. But again, that number is expected to change, and evacuations are now underway near the damaged nuclear plant. More than 180,000 people are now have been moved out of the area, and others may also go, depending on what happens at that nuclear plant. It's just one of the many major stories we're watching in Japan right now, and it happens to be one that could affect Americans as well, and we'll update you on what it means, in particular for Americans on the west coast of the United States, if this nuclear plant does continue with what's being described as a partial meltdown, or, God forbid, go into full nuclear meltdown. Well, last hour we heard that the fuel rods in 3 nuclear reactors were, quote, melting down. Keep in mind they lost their cooling systems, then they started to pump in the seawater, and now they are working furiously to keep them cool so we can avoid meltdown. Japanese officials saying that they could not tell what was happening in the heart of this plant. They just couldn't visually get an identifier on it. Dr. Victor Galinsky is a former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and he joins me now. Doctor, thank you so much for being here. For those of us who don't have anywhere near your background in this field, try to explain it to us, because the headline was, the fuel rods are melting. They lost their cooling systems. They've been totally exposed. They are trying to keep them cool, but we are told, tending to lose that battle. The seawater, they can't get it in fast enough. They can't access the fuel rods fast enough. And now they are saying, the Japanese officials, that the threat of a meltdown is rising.
Well, you know, the basic point is that when a reactor shuts down, the radioactive waste, still keeps producing heat, and you've got to get that heat away. And there's quite a lot of heat that continues to be produced. It tails off, but it's substantial, and it's enough to melt the fuel rods unless you've got water in there. They lost power from outside, which is necessary to power the emergency pumps. And normally you would go on to the diesel generators. These also got knocked out, as I understand it, because they lost their fuel supply. The fuel tanks, the diesel generators were hardened, but the fuel tanks were exposed, and the tsunami wiped them away. So they didn't have any power, and they couldn't pump water in there, and gradually the water steam just evaporated, and the level of water went down, and these fuel rods got exposed. The strongest indication of that is that we had these hydrogen explosions. Now, you don't get a hydrogen release or hydrogen produced unless you have the fuel rods exposed, because the hydrogen is formed by hot steam interacting with the cladding or the thin tubing that in which the uranium fuel pellets are, and there are thousands of these tubes in the reactor. And to have had that much hydrogen, it means they had to have been exposed for a long time and had to have been at elevated temperatures, say 2,000 degrees. And if that's been the case, very likely the fuel is damaged too, and may well have melted.
But let me just interrupt you so we can, you know, those of us without your education on this can try to hang with you on this, because just to put it in terms that I think folks can understand, you say this is what we're seeing there is more significant. I won't say worse, I'll let you characterize it, but more significant than 3 Mile Island, than the accident there, which was a partial meltdown, partial core meltdown in Pennsylvania.
Well, you know, people say partial meltdown. You've got about 100 tons of fuel in a reactor. Partial meltdown is some fraction of that is melted. That's a lot. That's a lot of melting. So the partial doesn't really take away from the seriousness of it. I think this is a more serious accident than the 3 Mile Island accident, even though the IAEA sort of said it was the other way around. For one thing, there are more reactors involved, and at 3 Mile Island, we didn't lose power. So I would put it in a more serious category.
Now, there is a question about whether if these fuel rods are not cooled adequately, there will be some sort of a melting on the bottom of the reactor. And there's a question about whether the bottom of the reactor in Japan can hold, because it wasn't designed to hold hot fuel like that. Is that likely now that we're told that they've been totally exposed, that these uranium fuel rods were completely exposed more than once, and that they have not been able to adequately cool them?
Well, it depends how much water they have in there, and whether they can get us some cooling, and we just don't know the details.
What happens if they continue overheating and they fall down to the floor below, the vessel below the reactor, which isn't designed to handle that kind of heat.
Well, the reason you're concerned about melting, aside from the fact that it destroys the whole system, is that it makes the waste inside that fuel more accessible to the environment. In other words, you're going through barriers that were supposed to protect people from the radioactive waste inside the reactor, inside the fuel. And the more you penetrate, first the tubing around the fuel, and then the reactor vessel itself, and the containment, then you're exposed to the environment. And that's the concern.
Yeah.